The ancient and Hellenistic Greeks played an outsized role in shaping the world, giving us things such as philosophy, democracy, theater, the science of history, and otherwise laying the foundations of Western civilization. Another thing they gave us was a plethora of titillating stories about fellow Greeks who died in some of the weirdest, most bizarre, and dramatic ways imaginable. Following are 16 of the ancient Greek and Hellenistic world's weirdest and/or most dramatic deaths. Number 1. Antiquity's greatest athlete got stuck in a tree and was eaten alive by wolves. Milo of Croton, flourished 6th century BC, was the most celebrated athlete and wrestler of the ancient Greek world, as well as a renowned warrior who led his fellow citizens to military victory. A strong man whose training regimen included carrying a bull on his shoulders, and whose daily diet reportedly included 20 pounds of meat, 20 pounds of bread, and 10 liters of wine, Milo's string of athletic victories was unprecedented and unsurpassed. He dominated the quadrennial Panhellenic Games, the Olympic, Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian Games, for decades. In antiquity, the inhabitants of Croton, modern Crotone in southern Italy, were famous for their physical strength, and the city produced generations of champions. In the 576 BC Olympics, for example, the first 7 finishers in the 200-yard sprint, the stade, were all from Croton. Milo would end up surpassing all who came before him. All in all, during a stretch from 540 BC to about 516 BC, ancient sources credit Milo of Croton with winning the wrestling championship in 6 Olympic Games, 7 Pythian Games, 9 Nemean Games, and 10 Isthmian Games. In addition to being a star athlete, Milo was no mean shakes as a war leader. In 510 BC, the tyrant of the neighboring city of Sybaris banished some of its leading citizens, and was offended when Croton offered them refuge. Things escalated, especially after the philosopher Pythagoras, who spent much of his time in Croton, urged its citizens to use the dispute as a pretext to destroy Sybaris. In the ensuing war, Milo led the forces of Croton to victory while wearing his Olympic crowns, a lion skin, and wielding a club like Hercules. His remarkable life came to a bizarre end one day while he was strolling through the woods, and came upon a tree trunk partially split with wedges. Always on the lookout for opportunities to challenge himself with feats of strength, Milo tried to rend the tree apart with his bare hands. However, the wedges fell off and his hands got stuck in the crack. It was a bad day for the strong man. His predicament got worse when a pack of wolves came upon him while he was struggling to free himself, and ate him alive. Number 2. Bupalus got dissed so bad he killed himself. Trolling that quickly escalates into something worse is not a newfangled development unique to the internet era, but has been around since forever, in just about all cultures around the world. The ancient Greeks, in particular, were no slouches when it came to trolling that sparked off flame wars. A good example was the steadily escalating back and forth trolling between Bupalus of Chios and the poet Hipponax of Ephesus. Both flourished 6th century BC, which culminated with Bupalus committing suicide after an epic takedown. Bupalus was a famous sculptor whose marble statues, typically of draped female figures such as Artemis, the Graces, or Fortune, were in high demand throughout the Greek world. Centuries after Bupalus' death, the Roman Emperor Augustus had his agents scour the Greek world for statues by the famous sculptor, which he used to decorate the Temple of Apollo in Rome. In addition to being a world-class sculptor, Bupalus was also a world-class troll, who had the misfortune to get into a tiff with an even bigger troll. Hipponax of Ephesus was a poet, but not one of those highbrow types like Homer or Hesiod, or a gentle soul who penned pretty verses about summer idyls in rolling meadows, as gentle lambs frolicked about. Instead, his bread and butter seems to have been in the territory of acerbic lines such as there are 2 days when a woman is a pleasure, the day one marries her and the day one carries out her dead body, and diss poetry. In addition to an ugly personality, Hipponax had a gargoyle face to match. The beef started when Hipponax sought to marry Bupulus' daughter, only for her father to reject him, sparing the girl from a life with somebody who was, by all reports, as ugly on the inside as he was on the outside. Bupulus then rubbed salt in the wound by caricaturing the unsightly Hipponax in some of his sculptures. Hipponax responded with rhymes that accused Bupulus of being a literal motherfucker, and went into graphic details about the sex acts the sculptor supposedly engaged in with his mother. Unable to stand the ensuing public mockery, Bupulus hanged himself. His fate became a byword, as illustrated by a line from ancient Athenian comic playwright Aristophanes: "Someone ought to give them a Bupulus or two on the jaw, that might shut them up for a bit." Number 3. Empedocles tried to prove that he was a god. Failed spectacularly. Empedocles, circa 492 to 432 BC, was an influential Greek pre-Socratic philosopher and poet from Acragas, in Sicily. He is credited with originating the theory of the four classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water, which sought to explain the complexity of the universe by reducing all matter to simpler substances. He was also a stone-cold nut job who seems to have genuinely believed that he was a god, and ended up getting himself killed in a bizarre attempt to prove his divinity. He was born into a prominent family, and his father was a pro-democracy local bigwig who played a prominent role in overthrowing his polis ruling tyrant in 470 BC. Empedocles followed in his father's footsteps, and helped overthrow an oligarchic government that took over Acragas after the tyrant was removed. He was reportedly offered his city's sovereignty, but declined. A genius in polymath, Empedocles was a gifted orator and poet, and was considered to be one of his era's greatest intellectuals and most talented physicians. His ability to cure diseases and avert epidemics won him widespread acclaim, and before long, he had developed a reputation for possessing marvelous powers. The accolades seemed to have gone to his head, and he eventually came to believe that he did, indeed, possess miraculous powers such as the ability to control old age, destroy evil, and control the winds and rains. His delusions finally bubbled over after he cured a supposedly incurable woman, whose ailment had defied all prior physicians. So he claimed he was a god. To demonstrate his divinity to skeptics, he gathered about 80 people, and led them to the top of an active volcano, Mount Etna. There he declared that as proof of his immortality, he would jump into the volcano, and return as a god after his body was consumed by the fire. Empedocles jumped into the volcano, but 25 centuries later, he has still not returned. Number 4. Philotas was so OCD pedantic that he starved to death while correcting others. Long before grammar Nazis, there was Philotas of Kos, circa 340 to circa 285 BC, whom ancient sources describe as an annoying and overly pedantic busybody who could not stop himself from constantly correcting others. A poet and scholar who tutored Egypt's King Ptolemy II, Philotas played a key role in popularizing the Hellenistic school of poetry, which flourished in Alexandria. Later poets, such as the Roman Ovid, refer to him as their model. A native of the island of Kos in the Aegean Sea, he was already an established poet and intellectual when his homeland was conquered by Ptolemy I of Egypt in 309 BC. The king appointed Philotas to tutor his son and heir, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and the poet relocated to Alexandria to perform his duties. He returned to Kos after his royal charge grew up, where he led an intellectual society of poets and scholars. While a brilliant man by all accounts, Philotas seems to have rubbed many the wrong way with an overbearing perfectionism and a need to point out every mistake he came across. All it took was for him to hear somebody utter a logical fallacy or use a wrong word, and Philotas would be off to the races, going into a pedantic frenzy of writing page after page detailing the error, why it was erroneous, and copious examples of what the correct usage should have been. According to ancient sources, he got so caught up in correcting others' mistakes, investigating false arguments and poor word choices, that he starved to death while researching and writing an essay about somebody's erroneous word usage. An inscription in front of his tomb read, Stranger Philotas is my name, I lie. Slain by fallacious arguments, and cares, protracted from evening through the night. Number 5. Draco was applauded to death. Draco the lawgiver, flourished 7th century BC, was an ancient Athenian legislator who reformed the city's legal system with law codes and courts to enforce them, replacing traditional tribal oral laws and blood feuds. The Athenians, who had asked him to come up with a new set of laws, were shocked when he came up with an extremely harsh legal code that punished both serious offenses and trivial ones with death. The severity of his legal system gave birth to the term draconian, to refer to exceptionally harsh penalties. We know little of Draco's background, but he was most likely a member of an Athenian aristocratic family. In the 620s BC, he was asked by his fellow citizens to come up with a legal system to replace the private justice one prevailing at the time, in which rights were enforced by citizens and their relatives. That lent itself to bloody vendettas and chaos, and a law of the jungle in which only the strong and those with connections were protected, while the weak were preyed upon by the powerful. Draco put Athens' laws in writing and had them published, thus reducing the pitfalls of traditional oral laws that were known to only a select few and were arbitrarily interpreted and applied. That was a huge step towards equality under the law, but the drawback was that Draco made the laws insanely severe and highly favorable to creditors and the propertied classes. Defaulting debtors were liable to be sold into slavery, and those committing petty offenses, such as stealing a cabbage, were liable to the death penalty. When asked why he legislated death for most offenses, Draco replied that he considered the petty crimes worthy of death, and he could not think of a higher penalty for the greater offenses. Whatever the poor and indebted might have thought, wealthy Greeks apparently liked Draco's laws so much that they reportedly killed him with applause. Literally, ancient Greeks showed their approval by throwing hats and items of clothing at an object of adoration, and during a visit to Aegina, its citizens showered him with so many hats and shirts and cloaks that he suffocated to death under the barrage. Whatever praise he might have earned in his lifetime, Draco's laws were eventually viewed as intolerably harsh by Athenians. In 594 BC, they turned to another lawgiver, Solon, who repealed Draco's laws and replaced them with new ones, retaining only his predecessor's homicide statute. Number 6. One of the Hellenistic IRA's greatest generals was killed by an old woman armed with a roof tile. Pyrrhus of Epirus, 319-272 BC, was a Hellenistic general and statesman who started off as a tribal king, before becoming king of Epirus in the Western Balkans. A distant relative of Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus was a formidable enemy of both the kingdom of Macedon and a rising Rome. His costly victories against both gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, a victory that comes at such a high price that it amounts to a de facto defeat. Pyrrhus was born to struggle and strife. His father was an Epirote who got dethroned when Pyrrhus was 2 years old, and the family had to flee and seek refuge with a nearby Illyrian tribe. His tribal hosts put Pyrrhus on his father's former throne in 306 BC, but he was dethroned 4 years later, and forced to hit the road and make a living as a mercenary officer. He ended up in Egypt, where he married King Ptolemy I's stepdaughter, and his new in-law gave him financial and military backing that restored him to the Epirote throne in 297 BC. Pyrrhus then spent the next few years making a name for himself as a brilliant general in a series of conflicts in the Balkans. In 282 BC, the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy got into a dispute with an expansionist Rome, and turned to Pyrrhus for help. Encouraged by a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi, and eager for an opportunity to create an empire in southern Italy, Pyrrhus agreed. He formed an alliance with the neighboring kingdom of Macedon, and landed in southern Italy in 280 BC with an army of about 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 2,500 archers and slingers. He defeated the Romans in costly battles whose losses he could not afford, but which the Romans, with their deeper manpower pool, were able to bounce back from. After one such victory, equipped if we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. Taking a break from Italy, he took off to fight the Carthaginians in Sicily, but by the time he returned the Romans had recovered and formed a vastly superior army. So Pyrrhus cut his losses and left Italy in 275 BC. His end came in 272 BC, when he took sides in an internal dispute in the city of Argos. An old woman threw a tile from a roof that hit Pyrrhus in the head, knocking him off his horse and snapping his spine. Whether or not he survived the fall, his fate was sealed when an enemy soldier rushed in and beheaded the Epirot king. Number 7. Thucydides was killed mid-sentence. Thucydides, circa 460 to circa 404 BC, was ancient Greece's greatest historian, best known as the author of History of the Peloponnesian War, recounting the 5th century BC conflict between Sparta and Athens. His methodology, applying strict standards of objectivity, impartiality, and evidence gathering, while eschewing references to divine intervention, led to him being dubbed the father of scientific history. His analysis that the conflict and the decisions of the actors were driven by self-interest and fear led to him getting dubbed the father of political realism as well. Thucydides was a distant relative of the Athenian general Miltiades, victor of the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, and he was elected one of Athens' 10 generals at a relatively young age. However, he did not turn out to be as great a general as Miltiades had been, and when he lost the strategically important city of Amphipolis to a surprise Spartan attack, his fellow citizens turned on him. Thucydides was recalled to Athens, tried, convicted, and exiled. The exile might have been a personal misfortune to Thucydides, but it was a stroke of good fortune for history, as it gave him the opportunity to write down his seminal work. He spent much of his now abundant free time carefully noting and writing down the events of the epic struggle, from the perspective of both sides. The history of the Peloponnesian War is the most reliable source we have on the war, and one of the most reliable sources for ancient Greek history. Unfortunately, Thucydides' history of the conflict, which stretched from 431 to 404 BC, is not complete but abruptly cuts off at 411 BC. When the war ended with an Athenian defeat in 404 BC, there was a change of government in Athens, which allowed Thucydides to return home after a 20-year exile. However, the political situation was precarious, with a new oligarchic regime supported by Sparta, which engaged in political violence against those who had supported the democracy that ruled Athens during the war. In the midst of that turmoil, Thucydides was killed in the middle of writing a sentence in his history book. Number 8. Heraclitus covered himself in poop and was eaten alive by dogs. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus, 535 to 475 BC, contended that the essence of the universe is constant change. So he coined the phrase "no man ever steps into the same river twice," in recognition of the notion that everything, like droplets of water drifting downstream on a river, is in constant motion and flux, even if the motion is hard to notice. He also propagated the notion of a unity of opposites, whereby the universe is a system of balanced exchanges in which all things are paired in a relationship with things exhibiting contrary properties. Heraclitus was self-taught and critical of other philosophers. He had a dim view of humanity and loathed mobs and democracy, preferring instead rule by a few wise men, a concept that Plato later distilled into the notion that the ideal ruler would be a philosopher king. Heraclitus viewed wealth as a form of punishment, and wished upon his fellow Ephesians, whom he hated, that they would be cursed with wealth as punishment for their sins. In other words, Heraclitus was a misanthrope, and his misanthropy led him to avoid contact with other people for long stretches, during which he wandered alone through mountains and wilderness, surviving on plants and what he could scavenge. As Diogenes summed him up, finally Heraclitus became a hater of his kind, and roamed the mountains, surviving on grass and herbs. His death came about when he was afflicted with dropsy or edema, a painful accumulation of fluids beneath the skin and in the body's cavities. Physicians could offer neither cure nor relief, so Heraclitus applied his self-teaching skills to medicine, and tried to heal himself. He attempted an innovative cure by covering himself in cow dung, on the theory that the warmth of the manure would dry and draw out of him the noxious damp humor of the fluids accumulated beneath his skin. Covering himself in cow manure, Heraclitus lay out in the sun to dry, only to become immobilized when the dung dried around him into a body cast. He was thus unable to shoo off a pack of dogs that came upon him and ate him alive. Number 9. Eliezer Maccabees had an elephant fall on top of him. Eliezer Maccabees died 162 BC, was the younger brother of Judas Maccabeus, leader of the 167 to 160 BC Maccabean revolt against the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire. The revolt stemmed from a ban on Jewish religious practices by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who ordered Jews to worship Zeus instead. The rebellion began when Eliezer's and Judas' father killed a Hellenized Jew who sacrificed to Greek idols, then fled into the wilderness with his 5 sons and launched a guerrilla campaign. Judah took over the revolt after the father died, and in 164 BC he entered Jerusalem and restored Jewish worship at its temple, an event commemorated in the Feast of Hanukkah. Eliezer's bizarre death came at the Battle of Beth Zechariah in 162 BC, 2 years after his older brother Judas had captured Jerusalem. The conquest was incomplete, however, as a Seleucid garrison retained control of a fortress inside the city. Judas besieged the fortress, but a Seleucid army of about 50,000 men, accompanied by 30 war elephants, marched to its relief. Judas lifted the siege and marched out at the head of 20,000 men to meet the Seleucids. Judas formed his men to meet the enemy in formal battle, abandoning the guerrilla tactics that had won him victories and served him well until then. It was a mistake, as Judas' forces proved no match for the Seleucid heavy infantry phalanx, professional cavalry, and armored war elephants. The latter in particular unnerved the Jewish defenders, who began to panic and break in fear of the pachyderms. Eliezer sought to encourage his comrades by demonstrating the elephant's vulnerability, so he charged at the biggest elephant, got beneath it, and thrust his spear into its unarmored belly. He killed the beast, but did not get to savor his success for long. The dying elephant collapsed on top of Eliezer and crushed him to death. His comrades did not rush in to emulate him, and the demonstration did not keep the Jewish army from breaking apart and fleeing soon thereafter. Number 10. Miltiades saved Athens, but got no love from the Athenians. Ancient Athens' Miltiades, 550 to 489 BC, was a general best known for his victory at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, an upset victory against a numerically superior force, which saved Athens from Persian conquest. He was born into a wealthy aristocratic family, which owned a private kingdom in the Chersonese, today's Gallipoli Peninsula, and which Miltiades inherited in 516 BC, when Persia's king Darius I invaded the Chersonese in 513 BC. Miltiades submitted and became a Persian vassal. In 499 BC, the Ionian Greeks of Asia Minor revolted against Persian rule. Miltiades marched against the rebels, but secretly supported their cause and helped funnel them aid from Athens. Athens sent an expeditionary force which joined the rebels in marching to the Persian governor's seat in Sardis, putting it to the torch. The Persians eventually crushed the revolt in 495 BC and discovered Miltiades' betrayal. He fled to Athens, where he was elected one of its 10 generals. The Persians determined to punish Athens for aiding the Ionians, and sent a punitive expedition that landed on the plain of Marathon north of Athens in 490 BC. The Athenians marched out with a force of about 10,000 hoplites, heavily armored infantry, with no cavalry or archers. They faced a Persian force of at least 25,000 infantry, plus thousands of archers and 1,000 cavalry. The Athenians, who had 10 generals and a rotating command system, wavered. For over a week, they simply watched the Persians from heights overlooking Marathon, until Miltiades turned to take command. He convinced a closely divided war council to give battle. Descending from the heights, Miltiades assembled the army with reinforced flanks and a weakened center, and advanced. Once they got within Persian archery range, he ordered his men to charge at a full run. They rapidly closed the distance, and smashed into the lightly armed Persians. The Athenians' reinforced flanks pushed back their opposition, then wheeled inwards to attack the Persian center, which panicked, broke, and fled in a rout to the safety of their beached ships. It was a stunning victory, with the Athenians and their allies losing about 200 dead to the Persians' 6,400. Miltiades returned to Athens in glory, but it would not last. A year later, he led a strong expedition against some Greek islands that had supported the Persians, but it turned into a fiasco, in which he also sustained a severe leg wound. Miltiades' failure seemed so absurd to his fellow citizens that they figured it could only be explained by deliberate treachery. So the Athenians, whom he had so recently saved, tried him for treason. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to a heavy fine. While locked up pending payment of the fine, he died in prison when his leg wound became infected.